January 1990, a Columbia jetliner ran out of fuel and crashed short of Kennedy Airport in New York. More than 70 people died. Fortunately, major crashes like this are rare.
The risk faced by an individual, according to some latest numbers that I've seen here in the United States, is something like you'd have to fly one trip per day for 19,000 years before, on the average, you'd be exposed to a fatal accident. So that's some indication of how safe it really is.
Despite the overwhelming statistics, there is still an unreality to flight. Even though the experts keep reminding us air travel is far safer than driving, flight is a defiance of gravity.
Okay, I'll strap the passengers in just in case.
It's going to ease off the pressure.
It means surrendering control, albeit to well-trained, tightly monitored pilots. Tons of metal lifting skyward is still hard to believe, even though it's routine. To ensure safe flight and to reassure the public, the aviation community must perform to rigorous standards. But crashes still happen, like this one at Sioux City, Iowa. To prevent what is often preventable, there's a system designed to feed the lessons of a crash back to the aviation community. The causes of crashes and near crashes are recorded and distributed globally to help keep the accident rate low. It's up to investigators to find the seeds of a crash, whether it was a mechanical problem, ice on the wings, unfamiliarity with the aircraft, poor communication, disregard of procedures, economic pressure, or a mixture of several factors which led to a bad decision. This was once an Air Ontario F-28 passenger jet. 24 people were killed when it crashed in Dryden, Ontario in 1989. Investigators can spend months, even years, combing twisted fragments like this for clues to explain why a crash happened. For the next hour, we'll find out how the experts fit the pieces together. For investigators, the speed and angle of impact are vital first clues. An amateur video captured both when this A320 crashed at a French air show in 1988. In a demonstration, the pilot flew too low and couldn't power up quickly enough to avoid the trees. 3 people were killed. A shallow impact, leaving large parts of the aircraft intact, suggests some measure of control before the crash. A crash shortly after takeoff suggests a problem with lift or engine power, perhaps a buildup of snow and ice on the wings, which hampers lift. Wreckage found some distance from the main crash site means the stray parts likely had a relationship to the cause. Wreckage scattered over a wide area, such as in and around Lockerbie, Scotland, points to a violent in-flight breakup, in this case, a bomb. Perishable evidence must be captured first. For instance, marks on the ground, which suggest how the aircraft hit. The plane's history. The pilot's history. All basic questions for crash investigators like Dave Rohr.
When you walk into an accident site, you don't want to have any preconceived ideas, and you don't want to jump to any conclusions. You want to basically, the first phase of an investigation is to gather all the facts before any analysis of those facts is done. So you become like a sponge.
If you're stuck with only one witness, then that's a problem. But if you have several witnesses, you can lay it out on a matrix. In other words, if you get a very complicated accident, you can ask several witnesses the same question, and you'll get some idea of a pattern in what they saw. Like, you know, maybe one person might say, no, the wheels were up, and maybe 5 others would say the wheels were down. Well, it's probably pretty good information that the wheels are down. But if you just had one witness that said, no, the wheels are up, well...
A series of aircraft components drastically affects performance. Besides the obvious, the engines and the wings, there are key control surfaces which are moved to steer and control a plane. On takeoff, the flaps, which are on the back of the wings, have to be extended to help create lift. On landing, panels called spoilers on the top of the wings are raised to kill lift.
And we follow through with all of the systems. We would look
Investigators
at
like Bill Taylor must determine from the wreckage the position of controls at impact. In this case, the takeoff crash at Dryden, Ontario.
Examination of these panels can tell us whether the flaps and spoilers, or the lift killing devices, that is the devices that destroy the lift when the aircraft lands, whether they were open or closed. And you can see on this one, for example, how there is deformation across the panel and the adjacent structure that shows us that this panel was closed. And
Now, you can tell that it's something that happened as a result of the crash or before the crash, or, I mean...
Yes, it's really not all that sophisticated technique. It's a case of looking at structure of the panel and the adjacent structure. And if the damage is matching, then you can make a reasonable assumption that that panel was in the closed position.
All these systems, which are usually operated by cables, are traced from the cockpit controls at the front of the plane through the hull of the aircraft. Boy, the pilots were sitting in the air?
Yes, it's very badly broken up, and really all of the control column assembly is missing. But we do have the rudder pedal mechanisms here, right. And we would be looking at such things as the fractures on the linkages. And although we can't make a positive determination, it's fairly easy to get a rough idea of whether that is a crash-induced fracture or something that existed prior to the accident.
Sure sounds like a needle in a haystack problem.
It does, but the thing is that if you approach it in a systematic manner and take it system by system, as I was pointing out here, the rudder system, and trace that all the way through, right to the end, then start with the next system, the aileron system, for example, and trace that right through, first to the one side, then to the other, and do that with each of your systems. It's actually a fairly straightforward operation. Obviously, in an accident such as this, there are going to be gaps. In this aircraft, the center portion of the aircraft was burned out almost totally, and control runs through that area were almost totally destroyed. So you're going to be left with areas where you cannot say with certainty that the system was intact.
At Norton Air Force Base in San Bernardino, California, the remains of 35 military planes have been placed in the sand. They are laid out to scale, just as they were found after they crashed. The University of Southern California uses this crash lab to help train investigators. Today's group is trying to find out why this F-84 fighter jet crashed in the 1950s. The F-84's wheels are at the center of this investigation. When the landing gear is lowered, a pin locks it into place. When the plane crashed, the wheels left scars on the ground. The students, mostly pilots and aerospace engineers, measured the distance between the scars. Comparing that figure with the actual width between an F-84's wheels, they discover a discrepancy.
It probably hit and tumbled that way.
I guess. Want to go the length of these things? I guess.
Examination of the nose wheel leads to the next clue.
Well, this would be a down lock, so when it was down and locked, you'd expect that to be engaged in this hole.
Oh, yeah.
So there's an indication here that just maybe the gear wasn't locked down.
But is it sheared?
No, it's not sheared. The pin's there.
So it's fully protruded externally then?
Yep. It's not.
So it was never down and locked?
Well, if it was, it would be actually sheared
a shear
off.
point there, right?
It would be sheared, wouldn't it?
If he hit in the right attitude,
They
flat,
would be 20 feet.
That's right.
Okay, but they're not. They're 23.
Not. They're 23.
So he had to hit one wheel and one wingtip.
That's right.
And whichever has the 10 feet between scars, that's the wheel that was down. And that's what...
You mean that, well, yeah, but we're assuming all the gear's down at this point.
No.
Well, the gear lever handle's down.
Well, yeah, but the gear may have failed. The gear may have not come down, and that's why he ejected.
I think that well, that's possible. But according to what we have some pre-information...
The measurements still don't make sense to them.
When he went through.
The instructor, Ted Bannock, explains why.
The reason for the disparity in the measurements is that the right main gear was overextended. It had gone about 12 inches or 14 inches. I think you found a difference between the...
Yeah, there was. You could just see it.
So it was in the trail.
The instructor then confirms the student's suspicion about the pin on the nose wheel.
Partially extended.
And they go back out to the field to re-examine the evidence.
Here's the pin, and you can see the pin is beveled, which helps the pin go into the locked position. And if this gear was down and locked, that pin would be through the hole. If it was down and locked when the aircraft hit, it would have been torn out, this pin would have been bent, or this would have been bent back. It would show all kinds of evidence of brute force disconnect.
When the wheels were raised, they did not lock into place. The landing gear handle was not all the way up. The pilot was distracted.
Of course, this pilot is making a formation takeoff, and he doesn't want to fall out of position or take his eye off the leader, so he reaches down there and slaps the gear handle up and assumes it is in the up and lock position. Never goes down there, and in order for him to see this on the left console and sub panel, he'd have to get his head down there or move his head purposely to try to see that, and he's not going to take his eye off the leader in a formation takeoff. But anyway,
when the pilot pulled out of a dive, gravity pulled the landing gear out. The pull was so strong, it damaged the flight control system. The pilot could no longer control the plane, and it crashed. In essence, it was a design fault. Pilots couldn't easily check whether the landing gear lever was in the locked position. It was too hard to see the lever. It cost a life.
The bad thing about this was not the first time the gear had fallen down. And what this illustrates is the importance of a good reporting system. Because the loss rates were so high back then, if somebody came back and said, well, the gear handle came out on me while I was pulling G's. And they said, well, if you would have put it all the way up and locked, it wouldn't have happened. So they would ground check okay, and nothing was further said about it. Nothing, no incident report, no investigation, no distribution of information to inform all the other crews of this possibility. So the word was never passed around.
Few plane crashes are exactly alike. Some, in fact, are relatively simple to solve and prevent. This Cessna 150 crash in Ontario killed the pilot. Steve Musson investigated.
The pilot in this case had radioed that he was having control difficulties and that he was going to come around and land on another runway. And he did successfully get the aircraft around by either manipulating the trim control or something. He somehow got the aircraft around and got it lined up on final to land. But then as he got close to the runway, the aircraft was observed to pitch up and down, the nose pitch up and down, and it went straight into the ground.
There was an obvious clue. The elevator cable, one of the key flight controls, was severed. When the pilot moves the control column back and forth, it moves the elevator at the tail. This controls the pitch, or up and down movement of the plane. In fact, the elevator cable had melted. But why? A modification, not by Cessna, had been made to some 150s, including the one that crashed. A larger, heavier engine had been installed. To offset the weight of the bigger engine, the battery had been moved back to a position close to the elevator cable. So close that the battery cable rubbed against the elevator cable, which then melted. A simple, well-meaning modification led to tragedy. Within days, an official notice suggested all owners inspect their planes, and within weeks, it became mandatory for all aircraft worldwide to be fixed. A distribution of information designed to prevent a similar crash. Following the wreckage trail is only part of the detective work involved in finding the cause of a crash. After an accident, aircraft parts require detailed lab analysis. The most commonly known parts that must be examined are the so-called black boxes, devices that record aircraft performance data, as well as voices and sounds in the cockpit.
Speed was essential. The survivors were starting to freeze to death in the icy water.
In 1982, these pictures captured the dramatic rescue of survivors just after their plane hit a bridge in Washington, D.C. The investigation of this crash was a clear example of how the cockpit voice recording can be used. As the Air Florida 737 waited in line to take off, snow and ice built up on the wings. According to the tape just before takeoff, the co-pilot said, "That's not right." The captain brushed him off. "Nah, I don't think that's right," the co-pilot said. But there was other information on the tape that helped investigators. The voice recorder analyst was Paul Turner.
We don't just listen to the voices on the cockpit voice recorder. We listen to all the background sounds as well. In fact, the background sounds frequently tell us more than the voices themselves. Because in this particular case of the 14th Street Bridge aircraft, the voices, while they told us something, didn't really clue us into what was occurring until such time as we listened to the engines in the background.
Turner analyzed the frequency of the background sound, the sound of the engines. When compared to a similar jet with engines at takeoff thrust, it was clear the Air Florida plane's engines were different.
And we compared it with what he was saying. And when he said takeoff thrust, when he said he had takeoff thrust, we could tell from the spectrum analyzer that he didn't have takeoff thrust.
A jet engine has a small probe which relays engine power to a gauge in the cockpit. The gauge read takeoff thrust. But beneath it, other dials such as the RPM gauge, another indication of engine power, showed something different, a lower reading. That's what looked different to the co-pilot. Because they didn't turn on the engine anti-ice switch, the probe that measures power froze and gave a falsely high reading. But the captain chose to go, ignoring the co-pilot's concerns. The jet made it off the ground, but not over the bridge.
So what happened is they tried to take off this airplane with 85% of power. Now, they probably would have made it if they didn't have any ice on the wings and if they didn't have any snow on the wings.
Had the captain listened to the co-pilot, had the co-pilot been more assertive, perhaps 78 people would not have died. The cockpit recording is now being tested for another, even less obvious use. When an aircraft breaks up in flight, such as the Air India 747 over the Atlantic, there is always the question, was it a bomb? Or did the aircraft break apart on its own? At the National Research Council in Ottawa, Frank Slingerland thinks he can answer this with sound waves. When a plane breaks apart, Slingerland says the cockpit tape keeps running for a fraction of a second.
If we have a bomb which suddenly goes off, it generates a great deal of gas and the aircraft sort of inflates. And when it does, all the frequencies rise. Then somewhere something lets go, a hole develops, and we have a decrease in pressure. And I follow this by a rise in frequencies followed by a drop in frequencies. When an aircraft is shocked by some impulsive force due to an explosion or the popping open of some part of the aircraft, waves travel up and down the aircraft at very high speed, and when they arrive in the cockpit, they shake the cockpit microphone, and this makes it generate a signal, and it says, oh, I hear something, but what it's really hearing is vibration. And these recurring pulses of vibration as they pass the microphone can be analyzed in such a way as to locate the source of the force and to diagnose its cause, whether it be an explosion or an opening up of some part of the aircraft.
Slingerland has applied his theory to a number of cases, including the Japan Airlines 747 crash in 1985. The control surfaces on the plane's tail blew off due to faulty repairs by the manufacturer.
If something failed, such as the Japan Airlines rear bulkhead failure, that's like the popping of a champagne cork, and everything just goes down in pressure.
So there isn't that prior rise?
No prior rise. And that's what distinguishes the bomb from the structural failure. And in each case, it has given results which could be verified by directly examining the aircraft where it survived, or which agreed with the available evidence and the other recordings of the aircraft.
In addition to the voice recorder, large aircraft as well as many commuter planes are equipped with another so-called black box, the flight data recorder. The black boxes on early jets, such as the DC-8, only recorded a few basic measurements such as airspeed, heading, and altitude. Newer airliners, such as the 747-400, have flight recorders which gather close to 300 bits of information about a plane's performance. Today's flight recorder stores information digitally. Patterns of ones and zeros are decoded to analyze how a plane was flying before an accident.
This is what we call a chase plane view. And as the airplane flies
Mike Poole runs the Flight Recorder Lab at the Transportation Safety Board in Ottawa. He uses black box data to reconstruct, and in this case, help solve the cause of a crash.
And here we're just moving the airplane along the flight path, and the airplane experienced a loss of control at about 3,000 feet above ground and went into a hard left roll. Here you can see the roll just starting. Went into a hard left roll, and the airplane rolled around completely once and began to come around a second time. And at this point, the crew was able to break free the flight controls and bring them back to neutral. The airplane stopped rolling, began to slowly roll back. But of course, at this point, he is in a very severe situation. He's not going to be able to recover. There's not enough ground, there's not enough altitude left, and he's going very fast at this point.
The system also gives a cockpit display to show the instruments and the pilot's view. They had only seconds to react. The aircraft, a cargo plane, quickly lost altitude. The pilots didn't have enough time to pull out of the roll. The board believes that due to design and maintenance, the ailerons, which control the roll of the aircraft, were held at extreme positions by air pressure. This contributed to a loss of control. Both crew members were killed. Black box technology does not work for every case. Most small aircraft don't carry flight recorders because of the expense, so investigators must use other methods to extract information about a plane's behavior before a crash. At the engineering lab in Ottawa, Jim Foote studies the instruments that are pulled from the wreckage. Cockpit gauges are analyzed for their positions at impact.
You may not get the exact cause of the accident, but you can get evidence that can help determine whether the engine was running or not.
Light bulb filaments are also analyzed. When a bulb is on, the filament is hot and bent out of shape. Under magnification, this is easily seen. If a bulb was on at impact, it's reasonable to assume there was still electrical power at the time of the crash. Jim Hutchinson heads up the department that analyzes how materials fail in crashes. For instance, he tries to determine whether a piece of metal failed because of fatigue or because of overloading.
This is a small piece of a propeller blade that's separated in flight on an aircraft. And what we're looking at here is the fracture surface of the propeller blade. This little area in here is a defect on the inside of the propeller, and these markings here indicate the progression of the crack as it moves outward. In this case here, we have a failure due to metal fatigue.
An overload failure is sudden and leaves a coarse surface with more bending. Bombs typically leave their own signatures on metal. A bomb leaves metal jagged and twisted and pockmarked from spraying shrapnel. And on fabric like upholstery, melted fibers indicate a sudden burst of heat from a bomb. Amateur videos and photographs have also become useful pieces of evidence for investigators.
Right now, we're looking at a witness photograph that was taken on the day of the accident of this particular aircraft. It's a P-51 Mustang.
Kind of a poor quality shots can be enhanced.
Okay,
The
so
Transportation Safety Board's John Garstang.
And now image processing just simply allows us to take an image that starts off, that appears initially to be not very good quality, and actually extract a lot of information that is there but that our eye can't perceive initially. And
But you're not adding information to it. Like when you say there's information there, when that photo captured that plane, even though we ourselves can't see it, there is in the grain itself, or the grains, some contrast.
Information. That's correct. Like image processing cannot show you something that does not exist. All it does is show information that is there that your eye cannot see, and it will now take that information and change the shade of gray that we're looking at.
Make it visible to our eyes.
Make it visible. So
that's what you're doing here.
Yes. So now what I'm going to do is take that concentration of dark shades of gray and bring them out into other shades of gray to see if there's any information. And as what I'll do is just change all the shades of gray right now. And now I'm changing those shades, and as we do it, we in fact see there is a lot of information in the shaded area on the aircraft.
That's astounding.
Now we can see a lot of detail on the aircraft to determine, well, we can quite clearly see things such as the rudder position, the elevator, study details to see if there's any unusual, say, warpage or bending in the airframe. So it is a tool, one of the tools investigators can use when they're fortunate enough to have an image to work from.
You know, the planes we fly on today are truly remarkable. Twin-engine jets routinely whisk people across the Atlantic. Yet until recently, the idea of a twin jet making transoceanic flights was out of the question. There simply wasn't the confidence in the engines. Today, there's confidence to spare. But while the aircraft and the engines have been dramatically improved, crashes still occur. Not because of the planes, but because of people. 80% of all crashes are caused by human error. And most of those errors are made right here in the cockpit. One of the classic cases in the study of human error took place in December 1978. A DC-8 left Denver for Portland, Oregon. The following is a reenactment based on the cockpit voice recording of what happened. The flight was scheduled to take about 2.5 hours. The plane had fuel for about another hour in case of emergency. As it turned out, it would not be enough. On approach to Portland, the landing gear was lowered, but the crew did not get the necessary 3 green lights to show all the wheels were down and locked. So they began to circle. The crew discussed the problem with the company's maintenance people on the ground. Eventually, a decision was made to make an emergency landing, which can be done safely. By this time, half an hour had passed. Then, the captain became preoccupied with a flight attendant about preparing passengers for a rough landing. But the other pilots were worried about fuel, referred to in pounds.
Estimate about another 15 minutes.
15 minutes?
Yeah. Give us 3,000 or 4,000 pounds on top of zero fuel weight.
Not enough. 15 minutes is going to really run us low on fuel here.
Right.
12 more minutes passed. The captain, who was highly experienced, continued his discussions with the flight attendant, but he didn't seem to notice the fuel problem, which was worrying the others.
We're gonna lose an engine, buddy.
Why?
We're losing an engine.
Why?
Fuel. Open the crossfeeds, man.
Open the crossfeeds there or something.
Showing fumes.
I think maybe we,
Showing 1,000 or better.
I don't think it's in there.
It's showing 3,000, isn't it?
Okay.
It's flamed out.
United 173 would like a clearance for an approach to 28 left now.
We're going to lose number 3 in a minute, too.
Well,
it's showing 0.
You got 1,000 pounds. You got to.
5,000 in there, buddy, but we lost it.
All right.
Are you getting it back?
No. Number 4, you got that crossfeed open?
No, I haven't got it open. Which one?
Open them both, goddammit. Get some fuel in there.
3 minutes later, this.
Boy, that fuel sure went to hell all of a sudden. Told you we had 4.
What's our distance now? Okay. About 3 minutes. 4.
We've lost 2 engines, guys. Sure. We just lost 2 engines, 1 and 2.
You got all the pumps on and everything?
Yep.
They're all going. We can't make Troutdale.
We can't make anything.
Okay. Declare a Mayday.
Hello, Portland, United 173 Heavy, Mayday, Mayday. The engines are flaming out. We're going down. We're not going to be able to make the airport.
56 seconds later, the plane crashed in suburban Portland. 10 people died, including the second officer. Ironically, because the fuel tanks were empty, there was no fire, so most on board survived. The investigation found that because he was preoccupied with the landing gear problem, the captain failed to respond to the fuel situation and to the advisories from his crew members. The safety board also reported that the other crew members were unable to successfully communicate their concerns about the fuel to the captain.
Just like everyone else, I feel everybody deferred to the captain and they respected his knowledge to an extent that they didn't even question their own.
What do we call it? We call that something
These
like
pilots from small Canadian airlines, Bearskin and First Air, have just studied the Portland case.
Did he hear?
He heard, but he didn't put 2 and 2 together and...
Crashes involving breakdowns in cockpit communications have led airlines to teach teamwork. This course, run by Continental Airlines, is an attempt to make captains better listeners and co-pilots more assertive.
Every time. Okay. So the captain is hearing but not listening. Okay.
Well, you'd acknowledge him with a yeah, sure.
Does that ever happen in our cockpits? Well, maybe not yours, Owen, but how about the rest of us? Does it ever happen? You ever been in an airplane that's happened?
That the fuel quantity has been...
No, that something was said and not communicated?
Oh, definitely, yeah.
And you live with it, probably?
Yeah.
The military has traditionally been a popular training ground for airline pilots. Flying a fighter jet is excellent experience for handling an aircraft, but a fighter is a single pilot operation, with a single pilot making all the decisions. A leading authority on pilot behavior is Robert Helmrich.
I think it's the white scarf tradition in aviation. We started out with a single pilot with a white scarf, and they tend to think of aviation as a one-person operation.
Check. Confirm there's no baggage in hold 4?
Not so today. Flying passenger planes like this 757 with several crew members requires teamwork and communication.
All right, it's 226 plus 2. Yeah. Final items?
An expert on cockpit teamwork is the National Transportation Safety Board's John Lauber.
One of the things that the captain has to do is create an atmosphere in that cockpit which says to his subordinates in that crew, if you see something that you don't like, I want you to speak up. I want to hear from you. I want you to speak out when you see something going wrong.
A1, rotate 17.
Positive rate. Gear up.
Positive flight.
Flight level change.
Level change.
Center command.
Center command.
We're not interested in creating a situation in the cockpit where they vote to make a decision. That is not the question. The captain is the captain. The captain has the legal and other authority to serve as the commander of that team. But that's very much different from saying that as the commander, I don't want to hear from subordinates. That I don't want to hear. In order to make a good decision, you have to have good data. And one of the ways you get good data is to ask people to speak up.
It's going to slow down the turn right here. Check.
This goal of improving crew communication is gaining wide acceptance at airlines, including smaller companies like Canada 3000.
We're cleared to 24 with a good rate through 28. And we're now proceeding direct to Buffalo.
Okay, I have control.
You have control.
Flight crew behavior is also being examined in another setting, the flight simulator.
80 knots.
80 knots.
These pilots for Canadian Airlines fly a mission in the simulator and must cope with a snag programmed into the flight. In this case, an engine fire on takeoff.
V1, rotate. Engine fire.
Check. Gear up.
Nice.
What distinguishes this simulator flight from others is the presence of a video camera which records how the pilots behave.
Engine fire failure number 2.
Fire drill number 2.
Confirm number 2, thrust lever.
Confirmed.
Closed.
Okay, so I'll roll a video here. We'll have a look at it. And I want you fellas then to look at your own performance. And
the U.S. Federal Aviation Administration's advisor on human factors is Clayton Fouché.
We're not used to seeing ourselves in a third-person perspective. And when you see yourself, you tend to be dissatisfied with your performance, and what you try to do is to change your behavior or your performance in a more positive direction. I think the same thing happens to airline pilots when they see themselves operating as members of teams. They see deficiencies in their communication styles. They see perhaps that they're coming across in ways that they hadn't realized or hadn't intended, and they very much try to modify their behaviors in a more positive direction.
A crash at Sioux City, Iowa is an example of how teamwork saved lives. A DC-10 with 296 people on board had an engine failure which resulted in the loss of flight controls. Theoretically, an impossible situation with no solution. But by manipulating the power on the 2 remaining engines, the crew was able to make an approach, even though the plane would only turn right. Unfortunately, they could not slow down enough, and the plane tumbled and exploded. But 185 people survived. The captain, Al Haynes, credited teamwork in the cockpit.
There is no hero. There is just a group of 4 people who did their job, and it was an unusual circumstance, but we put our best resources and knowledge together and did what we thought was best.
They were coping with 5 separate major problems simultaneously, and they would focus their attention from one to another, and dealing with a tremendous amount of information transfer. At one point, our measure of transfer, the thought unit, that is a measure of exchanging a single bit of information, they were exchanging information at up to 70 per minute, which means every second something is being communicated, and on 5 different topics. So to cope with that mass of information and make good decisions, I think an extraordinary tribute to good teamwork.
Let me ask the group about complacency.
Denny Pistol is a Boeing 727 captain for Continental Airlines. He also leads airline seminars on flight crew behavior.
Or recognize them in your own cockpit?
From his own experience with close calls in the cockpit, he's a strong supporter of flight crew teamwork.
Recently, I guess it was about 6 months ago, I was en route to Chicago. It was a beautiful day. We had a really good crew. We'd met for the first time down in operations the morning of our departure. We were Houston to Chicago. We had requested flight level 370, 37,000 feet. We were told to expect 37,000 because that was our filed altitude. However, for crossing traffic, we were told to maintain 33,000. That happened much lower altitude. As we were climbing out in my mind, I had 37,000 feet kind of set in there as a mindset. And as we were going through about 32,800 feet at a very high rate of climb, in the neighborhood of 2,000 feet a minute, the new hire, brand new second officer, second month on the line, leaned over and touched my shoulder and said, "Denny, we're just going to 33, aren't we?" And I pulled back the power and realized, and I said, wow, I just leveled the airplane right off. And it was that very valuable input that saved our crew from an altitude bust and potentially other things that could have occurred just because a crew member spoke up when he had to speak up.
I'll take the gear down now as well.
Gear down.
Speed back 150. Okay, center command.
Center command.
Okay, in approach mode.
It's engaged. Localizer.
Okay, there it
glide
goes.
Slope.
Okay, glide slope localizer. Reynolds alive. Gear is down. The flaps are 15. Flap 20.
Flap 20.
And landing check.
Gear.
Down 3 green.
Speed brake.
Armed.
Cabin crew notified. Flaps to go.
As planes became more reliable, we tended to look for what is the last piece of the accident situation that we haven't dealt with effectively, and that became the human. Although I suspect if we had the right tools to go back and look at crashes of the propeller planes, we'd find as many human factors problems as we have now. I don't think human factors problems developed. I think we've just focused on them.
There are a small number of people who are totally resistant to the idea. I look at those people as being our ultimate challenge, and I think that the people we worry most about are the ones who think they don't have a problem.
100. Check. 50. 30. 20. Operating. 80 knots. I have control.